thank you for having me. I appreciate it. This is the first in-person event that I have done since COVID started, so.
The before times.
Yes, yes. So everything has been, I've done a lot of interviews, but it's always been podcasts. Everything is done digitally, so this is a new experience. So thank you for having me. Earlier today, we went out, we had some shopping we wanted to do while we were here. Typically, we come to Toledo a couple times a month to grocery shop and different things. There's a lot more variety here. Things are very mundane, and it's a food monoculture where we live. And so we like to come to the big city to shop, and a few places we went and ended up at Walmart before we came over here. And as I was coming into the store, this older woman stopped me and was enthralled with my beard and the fact that I had a blue hat on, and you know, and it's common. I always tell Polly, I says, why is it that they're always 65 or 70, the women that hit on me, and not 25 or 30? But such is life. And then the next words out of her mouth were, "Are you a minister?"
Oh.
Now I typically avoid that, answering that, and I said, "No, I'm retired." And she said, "Well, what did you retire from?" And I said, "I am a writer." And then I changed the subject quickly, and again she complimented me on how I looked, and so there must be something about my look that gives me that minister vibe. But in reality, you know, I'm an atheist and a humanist today, but I pretty much maintain being a preacher to some degree. You know, I'm not a philosopher, though I can talk about philosophy. I'm not a scientist, though I can talk about science. I'm really just, you know, I'm a man that has a story to tell. And that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years. And so as I was thinking about speaking to you folks tonight, I said, okay, you know, what's the title of my sermon? And, you know, in my lifetime, I preached over 4,000 sermons. So I've written a lot of sermons in my lifetime. Some memorable ones, most of them not very memorable, and a few that were just dreadful, you know, and I remember those, every one of them. And so I was thinking, okay, what do I want to title this speech? And I thought, how about better late than never? I often get the people will come up to me, especially people that are lifelong atheists, for example. They'll come up to me and says, "Were you stupid or something? What took you so long, you know, to see the truth?" And as we were coming over here tonight, I told Polly, I says, typically there will be three types of people in a group like this. There will be people that have always been atheists. They have no real world experience with religion whatsoever. And then there'll be those that come from mainline church backgrounds. So some of the stuff I'm going to say tonight, you're going to look at that and you're going to say, huh? Because it's going to be totally foreign to your religious experience. Now, for someone like Mark and others, for those of us who come from an evangelical, fundamentalist church background, I'm going to say things tonight, you're going to say, yeah, I remember that. You've had that experience. And some of it's going to seem unbelievable at times, but it's very much part of the narrative of my life and the life that I've shared with Polly for these 43 years. And yes, that's my wife, Polly, and that's our 32-year-old daughter, Bethany. My journey pretty much began in 1962. My dad, always looking for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and packed us all up. We were living in Bryan at the time, and moved us all the way to San Diego, California. And he was just certain that was going to be the place where, you know, life came together for him. And he was going to make lots of money, and you know, it was the 1960s, and there was a lot of optimism, but unfortunately things didn't work out as he planned, and Dad drove a semi-truck in California just like he did in Ohio. And but while we were in California, my parents, we started going to church. My parents up until that point had been nominal Lutherans. We went to church on Sundays. I was baptized as an infant. But in 1962, they went to a church called Scott Memorial Baptist Church. And Scott Memorial Baptist Church at the time was pastored by a man by the name of Tim LaHaye. Tim LaHaye wrote the Left Behind books, the Sex Manual for Evangelicals, The Act of Marriage, and he was a prophecy guru, and so my parents took us to that church, and it was not long that Mom and Dad, made a profession of faith, were baptized, and joined the church. And so from that point forward, we were fundamentalist evangelical Christians. It was also during that time, however, that my parents were also introduced to the John Birch Society. And so not only were my parents devoutly Christian, they were also rabidly right-wing politically. And I have no doubt that they would have been Trump supporters today if they were alive. And so that was the ground that my life grew upon, is the evangelical church tradition and right-wing, primarily Republican politics. Now, we lived in California about 3 years, and then from there we moved back to Ohio, back to Bryan, where my mom and dad were from. And from that point forward, we were in church every time the doors were open. 3 times a week, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday. We always went to either independent fundamentalist Baptist churches or Bible churches or churches of some evangelical persuasion. And then in 1972, we moved to Findlay. Now, keep in mind, I've lived all over the place. Bryan, Farmer, Deschler, Ney, Mount Blanchard. I've lived in dozens and dozens of houses over the years. I went to numerous schools, but Findlay was that place where, at least for 2 or 3 years, life was somewhat stable for me. And we joined Trinity Baptist Church. It's a large church on the edge of, on the east side of Findlay. And it was there that, I made a profession of faith at the age of 15. Now, what's interesting about that is that I've kind of analyzed, okay, why did I have this religious crisis at age 15? Well, you take a step back and look at my life from a psychological, sociological perspective. And okay, so what was going on? Well, my parents went through a divorce. And 3 months later, my dad married a girl, and she was a girl. I was 15 at the time, she was 19. And she had a baby. You can go ahead and connect those two things together, because the child, I believe, was my father's. My mother also remarried. She married her first cousin. And so there was a lot of turmoil in my life and at home. And so the church became a place for me of safety, security. They offered me that family connection. It's where I learned that, your church family is more important than your blood family. And so I made a profession of faith at a revival meeting, and a week later I was baptized, and 2 weeks after that, I believed that God was calling me to be a preacher. And I went forward and confessed before the church that I believed that God wanted me to be a preacher. And 2 weeks after that, 2 or 3 weeks after that, I preached my first sermon. I was still 15 years old. And so I, all told, preached for 33 years from that point forward. And thus began my path towards the ministry and into the ministry itself. From that point forward, I was a devout a Christian in every sense of the word. I talk to, you get older and you kind of reminisce with some of the people that you went to high school with. People, all my friends were primarily people that went to the same church that I did, and they'll share their experiences. And I found out that my experiences were very different. I found out, for example, that, I maintained my virginity till I was married. And I stayed on the straight and narrow. I found out that most of the people in the youth group didn't follow that same path as I did. They just didn't. And I was shocked to learn that. I don't know why, as I look at it now, but I was a true believer. And I bought in for a variety of reasons. But nonetheless, I was very committed to following Christ and believing the Bible, and as it was taught to me and as I understood it. And so from there, at the age of 19, I went off to a small fundamentalist Baptist college in Pontiac, Michigan, and that's where I met Polly. Polly's a preacher's daughter. She went, and she'll tell you this, so I'm not telling anything out of school. She went to college for one reason, and that was to marry a preacher. And I was it. Now, according to Polly's mom, that was not a good deal. But, but we're 43 years into this thing, and so she just might as well realize that that's just how it is. And so we got married after our sophomore year of college, and 6 weeks after we married, Polly came home one day and she said, "I'm pregnant." And see, what happens is when you take two very naive children, and that we were very immature, and we had no real world experience, we had no training in sex education whatsoever. We didn't have birth control figured out. And when you don't have birth control figured out, guess what? Babies show up. And so 6 weeks into that, Polly was pregnant. 3 months later, I was laid off from work, and by the time we got to the end of our junior year of college, we left school and moved back to Bryan, Ohio, and that's where I began officially my time in the ministry. And over the next 25 years, I pastored churches, mainly Ohio, and one church in Michigan, and then one church in Texas, and that's what our life. We were committed and devoted to the work of the ministry. Now, if you look at our life, people, when I talk about these things, they'll say, "Oh, what an awful life," and I'll share some of the things that we experienced, and some of the things we believed, but all in all, we were quite happy. We enjoyed the life in the ministry, and quite frankly, for me, it's been hard for me to admit this. I enjoyed the attention. I enjoyed being that hub around which everything turned. Everyone, every Sunday I stood at the back of the church, and people shook my hand and thanked me for what a wonderful sermon I just preached. But I learned real quickly that were not necessarily good students of sermons, because I could preach some bad sermons and they would still tell me that it was wonderful. And even Polly, after church, I'd say, "Well, how was my sermon today?" And, "Oh, it was fine. It was great." I said, "Just once tell me it was terrible," because there were some of those, even though I worked very hard to make sure that my sermons were worth listening to. And so we were happy in the ministry. But if you take a look from our life from the outside, it looks very different. If you were in an evangelical, if you grew up as an evangelical before you deconverted, before you became an atheist, when you're inside that bubble, it all makes sense to you. But when you take a step outside of that, I'm going to cuss just one word here. You look at it and you say, man, I believe some batshit crazy stuff. I mean, it's awful. And so you take for us socially, for example, we didn't drink. We were in our 40s before we drank alcohol for the first time. Polly didn't wear pants. She was 46 years old before she wore her first pair of pants. And I remember we were standing in a Target in Yuma, Arizona, where we were living at the time. And there were some capris, and I said, why don't you, because I guess I'm the devil in this story, I says, because we were so Christian, I says, why don't you buy a pair of those? And this awful look came over her that she thought, no, because that would be a sin, and that, God's going to judge me if and I said, no, he's not. And so, so she was 46 when she finally bought and wore her first pair of pants. We were in our 40s, again, before we listened to, meaningfully listened to secular music, like rock and roll music. I told my counselor, I said, we're kind of, in some ways in our lives, we are living the 60s and the 70s now, because, we missed all of that the first time around. Because we grew up in a very structured environment where the man standing in the pulpit told us, do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this. And the list was endless. And it varied depending on what church that you attended. One church over here might think it's wrong for a woman to wear pants. This church over here will say, it's okay as long as they're modest. For example, I heard sermons on it was a sin to wear wire-rimmed glasses, for example. Why? Because they were worldly. Because that's what hippies wear. And truth of the matter is, if you're old enough to have lived in the 70s, you're right. Hippies did wear wire-rimmed glasses. Hair was another thing. I was in my 40s before my hair ever grew long. Before that, we had the Baptist bowl cut, where you off the ears and tapered in the back. And why? Because, having long hair on a man was effeminate, and it was a sign of the world. And there was one thing after another like that. These rules and these regulations. Again, we were in our 40s before we went out to a fine restaurant that served alcohol, because we didn't eat in places that served alcohol. It was a sin to eat any place that served liquor. For 20 years, we didn't have a TV. Not necessarily bad in the grander scheme of things, but the reasons behind it were faulty. And so our children, which we had 6 children, and have 6 children, not had, we still have 6 children. And, for the most of their lives, we didn't have a TV. And even when we finally decided to get a TV, my children would love to tell the story about Dad's battle with the television. We'd get a TV, and we'd have it for a few months. And then I'd feel all convicted about what we were watching on TV. And I'd get rid of the TV. And then 6 months later, I'd buy another TV. And this went on 4 or 5 times over the course of, several years before I just finally gave in to my sin. And we've had a TV ever since. Now, the truth of the matter is I like the Cincinnati Reds, and they're on TV. And so that pretty well ended that. In the late 1980s, and someone's going to have I cannot see that clock, so. Okay, all right. In the late 1980s, I embraced Calvinism, and that deeply affected us. Not just theologically, but how we viewed our life. At the time, we had 3 children. Our son who's 42 today, and then we have another son who's 40, and we have another son who's 37. Is that correct? And that was it. We were done. But in Calvinism, we're taught that God is sovereign. He's in control of everything. And, well, that includes the womb. And so we should be willing to have as many children as God gives us. And so there we started. And the first baby out of the chute after that was Bethany. And then one more right after that. And then less than 2 years later, one more right after that. And it's interesting because at that point was the first crack in our theology, in our belief in God's sovereignty, was the fact that the doctor came to Polly and said, look, you should stop having children. You run the risk of dying if you have any more children. And so we had a dilemma. What do? Trust God or trust the doctor? Now, thankfully, and probably for very selfish reasons, I looked at that and said, well, I sure don't want to be raising 6 kids the rest of my life by myself. I don't. And so that was the end of that. It was the first time we really let science and what common sense told us was the right thing to do instead of our religious beliefs. Because our whole life up until that point was everything we did was there was this religious motivation for doing it, whether it was how we lived our lives or the different places that we lived. Now, we pretty much lived that way until 2006, 2007. And then both of us started having real questions about what it was that we really believed. And our journey of deconversion began when we started looking at, we believed that the Bible was not only inspired, which is a faith claim, but also that the Bible is inerrant and infallible. Those can be proved or disproved empirically. Okay? And we came to the conclusion that the Bible was not inspired. It was not inerrant. It was not infallible. And you cannot underestimate enough how deeply that affected us, because our whole worldview was based on the fact that the Bible was without error. Everything that it said was true, as we interpreted it, of course. And at that moment, our world came crashing down. If the Bible's not infallible, if it's not inerrant, how do we know that anything is true? Instrumental, I think, at that time was we read a lot of Dr. Bart Ehrman's books, and he was very helpful in forcing us to take a hard look at what we really believed about the Bible. And from there it was just a matter of, and we spent countless hours laying in bed at night, and we'd read passages from various books, and we'd talk about these issues, and we started one by one going through the various things that we said we believed. Do we really believe that virgins have babies? Do we really believe that dead people come back to life after they've been dead for 3 days? Do we believe that Jesus really was a miracle worker and all these various claims that are found in the Bible? And we came to the conclusion, I came to the conclusion, that no, we no longer believe these things. I no longer believe these things. And when we came to that moment, we then realized that we were no longer, in any meaningful sense, Christians. Now, what were we then? Anybody been there? Where, you know what you're not, but what are you?
You're awake.
Yeah, yes, and that's actually you're absolutely right. And so in 2008, that was it. We were done. Last Sunday of November in 2008, we were attending the Methodist Church in Nay, and nice people, nice young pastor, and we just said we can't do this anymore. And so that was it. The only time we've been to church since have been for a couple funerals and a couple weddings. We avoid church like the plague. And so, from that point forward, we knew what we didn't believe, but then we had to start developing what are my positive beliefs? Of course, that brought me to humanism, of course. Atheism does not give me an ethical moral framework for anything. Anybody that tells you that, I disagree. Let's put it like that. It's humanism that gives me a moral, ethical framework to live my life. When Christians want to challenge me on things, I point them to, you just look at the Humanist Manifesto, for example, and a nice summary of what it is that humanists believe. And for us, it's been, and especially for me personally, is that I've had to go through my whole life and rethink what it is I believe. What are my moral beliefs? Before I was homophobic, transphobic, racist, bigoted, all the words that we don't like. I smiled and I was nice, loved Jesus, but all those things were still true. And so I've had to rethink through every one of those. Because, in evangelicalism, if there's one thing they're against, it's sex. I mean, unless it's monogamous, married, heterosexual sex, only in the missionary position, they're against it. And so we had to start rethinking those things. What is it we really believe about sex, and what we really believe about everything from abortion to euthanasia to all of these various things. And I often tell people, I says, what happened is over time, I started out life with a list a mile long of all these rules and regulations and that were the moral and ethical standard that I tried to live by and miserably failed every day of my life. No one could keep that standard, including Jesus. It was impossible to keep. And so now those things have kind of shrunk down to about a 3x5 card. Treat others as you want them to be treated. Don't be an asshole. Simple things like that. Rules that I want to live by. And so that's been basically my path from fundamentalism here to I'm an atheist and a humanist today. I've spent the last 14 to 15 years. Most people would say I'm a prolific writer. And so I have a widely read blog that, I'm blessed, I guess that would be the word used, grateful that I have a large number of readers and people are attracted to the story I tell. Why? Because they find themselves in similar circumstances as I was for many years. And what I share resonates with them. And because I was an insider, I know where the dead bodies were buried. I know what goes on behind the scenes. For all the moralizing from the pulpit on Sundays, I know the stories about what happened on Monday, Tuesday, and the rest of the week. Pastors who were committing all sorts of commonly called sins, even criminal behavior. And so my writing has been well received, and so I continue to write. But I write not necessarily for that as much as it is I just have a story that I want to tell. And I find it therapeutic. When people contact me and they're going through the deconversion process, I encourage them to write. Start a blog. Who cares if anybody reads it? Just write. or I give them an opportunity to write something for my site, and because I think it's important for people to share their stories, because everybody in here has a unique story. Your experiences are different from mine, and I think it's important for people to hear those stories, because look, what's the best way to reach people? We could have a wonderful debate about the existence of God, and we can talk about the Kalam argument or the cosmological argument, but look, I like listening to that stuff, but I also know that very few people are going to be brought to our side by those arguments alone. What they want to hear is how your beliefs have made a difference in your life. Why are you better off for being a humanist? Why are you better off being an atheist? And that's why I think it's important for us to share our stories. For me and for Polly, and we're still a work in progress. I don't have all the answers. I don't even have all the questions. And so we just continue to plod one day forward and one after another, and hopefully learn more and be better people than we were the day before. Questions?